Sometimes the loneliest souls find each other in the most unexpected places. Wade Thatcher had everything money could buy: sprawling ranch, fine cattle, respect in 3 counties, but hadn't shared a real conversation in months. When he rode into Elkhorn that cold December morning for winter supplies, he never expected to find a scraggly donkey pawing through garbage behind Murphy's general store. Most folks shooed the animal away. Wade didn't. Something about its quiet stubbornness, its refusal to give up even when the world had given up on it, struck him deep. What Wade couldn't know was that this unlikely friendship would change everything. But could a stubborn old rancher and an unwanted donkey really heal each other's wounded hearts? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The December wind carried the scent of snow across the Elkhorn Valley as Wade Thatcher stood on his wraparound porch, watching the sunrise paint the distant peaks in shades of gold and crimson. At 62, he cut an impressive figure against the mountain backdrop, broad shoulders still strong beneath his wool coat, silver threading through hair that had once been black as coal, and hands weathered by decades of honest work. The Thatcher Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land, a testament to 3 generations of careful stewardship and shrewd business sense. Wade pulled his grandfather's silver-trimmed pocket watch from his vest, feeling its familiar weight, 6:15, the same time he'd risen every morning for the past 40 years, long before the sun kissed the horizon. Routine had become his anchor, the one constant in a life that had seen more changes than he cared to count. The watch had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and now him, 3 generations of Thatcher men who'd built something lasting on this land. Sometimes he wondered who would carry it next. The cattle were already stirring in the far pastures, black dots against the frost-silvered grass. 500 head of prime Angus, each one representing years of careful breeding and attention to bloodlines. They were beautiful animals, healthy and strong, worth more than most people's houses. Yet standing there in the morning stillness, Wade felt the familiar weight of solitude settling on his shoulders like snow. Inside the kitchen, coffee percolated in the same metal pot his wife Margaret had used 23 years ago, before cancer took her in the space of a single autumn. The house still bore her touches: blue curtains she'd sewn by hand, the herb garden she'd tended outside the kitchen window, now maintained by his housekeeper Rosa, who came twice a week. But it was Wade's domain now, echoing with memories and the sound of his own footsteps. He poured coffee into a ceramic mug, another relic from Margaret's careful choices, and settled into his leather chair by the stone fireplace. The local newspaper lay folded on the side table, delivered before dawn by young Tommy Martinez, who'd never once missed a day in 3 years. Wade appreciated that kind of reliability, though he wondered sometimes what drove a 16-year-old to wake at 4 in the morning just to deliver papers to scattered ranch houses across the valley. The front page carried the usual mix of local politics and seasonal concerns. The town council was debating snow removal budgets again. Mrs. Eleanor Hennessy's granddaughter had made the dean's list at the state university. The winter stock show was scheduled for February, earlier than usual due to venue conflicts. Wade scanned the headlines with practiced efficiency, filing away information that might affect his business or the community he'd been part of all his life. Yet even as he read, his mind wandered to the day ahead. The supply run to Elkhorn couldn't be postponed much longer. His pantry was running low, and more importantly, he needed feed supplements for the cattle before the real cold set in. December in the Montana mountains wasn't forgiving to man or beast, and Wade had learned long ago that preparation meant survival. The town of Elkhorn nestled in a valley 20 miles east of his ranch, a community of 800 souls that had grown up around the railroad depot built in 1892. It was the kind of place where 3 generations might work in the same store, where everybody knew everybody's business, and where a man could still get credit on a handshake. Wade appreciated its unchanging nature. though he sometimes felt like a ghost, moving through familiar streets where fewer and fewer faces remembered his younger days. Murphy's General Store remained the town's anchor, run by Sean Murphy, grandson of the Irish immigrant who'd established it during the mining boom. Sean was a good man, honest in his dealings and fair in his prices, though he talked more than Wade preferred. The store carried everything from feed supplements to canned goods, hardware to winter coats, serving the scattered ranching community with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Wade finished his coffee and set the mug aside, already calculating the morning's tasks. He'd need to check the cattle in the north pasture, ensure the water troughs weren't freezing over, and review the feed inventory one more time before making his list for town. The systematic approach to ranch management had served him well, turning what his grandfather started into one of the most successful operations in the valley. But success, he'd learned, was a complicated thing. The bank account was healthy, the land paid for outright, and the cattle operation profitable enough to weather most economic storms. He'd achieved everything a rancher was supposed to achieve, built something worth passing on. The problem was having no one to pass it to. His son David had left for college 25 years ago and never returned, choosing law and the city over land and cattle. They exchanged Christmas cards and the occasional phone call, but the gulf between them had widened with each passing year until it seemed unbridgeable. David had his own life now, a successful practice in Denver, a wife who thought ranching was quaint but impractical, and children who saw their grandfather as a pleasant stranger from a world they didn't understand. Margaret would have known how to bridge that gap. She'd had a gift for bringing people together, for finding common ground where others saw only differences. Her laughter had filled the spaces between conversations. Her presence had made the big house feel like a home instead of just a place to eat and sleep. Without her, Wade had gradually retreated into the rhythms of ranch work, letting relationships atrophy like unused muscles. He rose from the chair and moved to the kitchen window. Looking out at the herb garden Rosa maintained so carefully, Margaret had planted those herbs with her own hands, each one chosen for its practical purpose or simple beauty. Rosemary for remembrance, sage for wisdom, thyme for courage. She'd believed in such things, the old connections between plants and human nature. Wade had once teased her about her witchy ways, but he'd never had the heart to remove the garden after she was gone. The morning routine continued with mechanical precision. Check the weather, cold but clear. Review the supply list, feed supplements, grain, groceries for the coming week. Call Miguel Hernandez, his ranch foreman, to coordinate the day's work. Miguel had been with the ranch for 15 years, a steady presence who understood cattle and land almost as well as Wade did. He was one of the few people Wade still considered a friend, though even that relationship remained bounded by the respectful distance between employer and employee. By 8 o'clock, Wade was ready for the trip to town. He'd chosen his oldest pickup truck, a reliable Ford that had served the ranch for nearly a decade. The newer vehicle stayed parked except for special occasions, another sign of his practical nature and reluctance to embrace unnecessary change. The truck's cab smelled of leather and hay, familiar scents that reminded him of countless similar trips over the years. As he drove down the long gravel driveway that connected his house to the county road, Wade caught sight of a red-tailed hawk circling high above the pastures. Margaret would have taken it as a good omen, a sign that the day held promise. Wade wasn't given to such fancies, but he found himself hoping she might be right. After months of routine and solitude, he was ready for something, anything, to break the predictable pattern of his days. The road to Elkhorn wound through valleys and over hills, past other ranches where smoke rose from chimneys and cattle gathered near windbreaks. It was beautiful country, harsh but honest, demanding respect from those who chose to make their living from it. Wade had never wanted to live anywhere else, never felt the pull of cities or the promise of easier lives. This land was in his blood, part of his identity as surely as his name or the color of his eyes. But as he drove toward town on that cold December morning, Wade Thatcher had no idea that his carefully ordered world was about to be disrupted by the most unlikely of companions, a stubborn donkey with nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. Elkhorn's main street stretched 6 blocks between the old railroad depot and the Methodist church, lined with false-fronted buildings that had weathered a century of mountain winters. Wade parked his truck in front of Murphy's general store, noting the familiar sight of other pickup trucks and ranch vehicles clustered around the town's commercial heart. Steam rose from exhaust pipes in the cold morning air, and the few pedestrians moved with the quick, purposeful stride of people trying to stay warm. The bell above Murphy's door announced his arrival with its familiar chime, and Sean Murphy looked up from behind the counter where he was arranging inventory sheets. Sean was a compact man in his 50s, with thinning red hair and the kind of easy smile that made customers feel welcome. His grandfather's old cash register still dominated the front counter, though a modern computer terminal sat discreetly to one side for credit card transactions. "Wade Thatcher," Sean called out, his voice carrying the slight Irish lilt that still colored the Murphy family speech. "Haven't seen you in town for a couple weeks. How are things out at the ranch?" "Can't complain," Wade replied, pulling a folded list from his jacket pocket. "Need to stock up before the real cold hits. Cattle are doing well, but they'll need extra feed if we get the snow they're predicting." Sean nodded knowingly. Weather was serious business in ranch country. The difference between profit and loss, sometimes between life and death. "I've got plenty of the supplement you usually take. Sweet feed came in fresh yesterday, and I set aside some of those mineral blocks you like. Maria's been asking about you, by the way." Wade felt a familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of Maria Gonzalez. She owned the small restaurant next to the hardware store, served coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and made the best green chile in 3 counties. More importantly, she was Margaret's cousin, and one of the few people in town who still treated Wade like family rather than just a prosperous customer. Their conversations had grown more meaningful over the past year, touched with the gentle possibility of companionship between 2 people who understood loss. "Tell her I said hello," Wade said, focusing on his list rather than meeting Sean's knowing look. "I'll probably stop by for lunch if I finish here early enough. She'd like that. Been making that cornbread you favor." Sean moved efficiently around the store, gathering items from Wade's list. The familiar ritual of commerce unfolded: canned goods, dry staples, practical items for a man living alone. Sean never commented on the bachelor's selection of groceries, but Wade sometimes caught a look of quiet sympathy in the store owner's eyes. They conducted their business with the comfortable efficiency of men who'd known each other for decades. Wade loaded the truck while Sean updated the delivery schedule for the heavier items, feed sacks and mineral blocks that would come out to the ranch later in the week. The system worked well, built on trust and mutual respect. Wade was securing the last of the grocery bags when he heard the commotion behind the store. Someone was shouting, not in anger but in frustration, the kind of voice people used when dealing with a persistent animal. He walked around the building's corner, curious about the disturbance that was disturbing Elkhorn's usual morning quiet. Behind Murphy's, where the loading dock met the alley, a small crowd had gathered. Tommy Martinez, the newspaper delivery boy, stood with his hands on his hips, looking exasperated. Mrs. Henderson from the post office held a broom like a weapon, and Jake Whitmore from the feed store was shaking his head in disgust. They were all focused on a small grey donkey that was methodically rooting through an overturned garbage can. The animal was in rough condition, its coat dull and patchy, ribs visible beneath winter hair that had never grown thick enough for Montana cold. It ignored the humans entirely, focused with single-minded determination on finding something edible among the scattered trash. Vegetable peelings from the restaurant, apple cores, anything organic that might provide sustenance. "Damn thing's been here for 3 days, Jake was saying. "Scares off customers and makes a mess of everything. Animal control's supposed to come out this afternoon, but until then, it's just going to keep causing problems. Shoo!" Mrs. Henderson waved her broom at the donkey. "Get out of here! Go on!" The donkey looked up briefly, acknowledged her presence with calm brown eyes, then returned to its foraging. There was something almost dignified about its refusal to be intimidated. A quiet stubbornness that reminded Wade of certain cattle he'd known, animals that had their own ideas about how the world should work. "Where'd it come from?" Wade asked, stepping closer to the group. Tommy shrugged. "Just showed up. Nobody knows who owns it or how it got here. Probably wandered down from one of the mining camps up in the hills. They used to keep burros up there for hauling equipment." Wade studied the animal more carefully. It was a jenny, a female, probably 6 or 7 years old, based on her teeth and the grey around her muzzle. Someone had cared for her once. Her hooves were properly trimmed, and there were faded marks where a halter had worn smooth patches in her coat. But that care was long past, and now she was just another discarded creature, trying to survive winter in the mountains. Animal control's going to put her down, Mrs. Henderson said, with the practical callousness of someone who'd lived around animals all her life. "Can't have strays wandering around town, and nobody's going to adopt a worn-out donkey. Shame, but that's how it is." Wade watched as the donkey found half a sandwich among the garbage and ate it with careful, methodical bites. She wasn't frantic or desperate in her scavenging, just persistent and thorough. Something about her patient determination struck him as familiar, an echo of his own approach to life, steady persistence in the face of circumstances beyond control. "Has anyone actually tried to help her?" he asked. Jake snorted. "Help her what? She's just a stray donkey, Wade. What are you going to do, teach her to balance books?" The comment stung more than Jake probably intended, carrying implications about Wade's solitary life and lack of practical companionship. But Wade ignored the barb and approached the donkey slowly, the way he'd learned to approach any unfamiliar animal. She watched him warily but didn't flee, perhaps recognizing something in his manner that set him apart from the others who'd been trying to chase her away. "Easy, girl," he said softly, extending his hand for her to scent. "Nobody's going to hurt you." She sniffed his fingers cautiously, then allowed him to stroke her neck. Her coat was rough and dirty, but underneath he could feel the solid bone structure of a well-bred animal. Someone had invested money in her bloodlines, had plans for her beyond simple packwork. Those plans had obviously come to nothing, but the quality remained. "You can't be thinking of taking that thing home," Sean Murphy had appeared. Drawn by curiosity about the gathering behind his store, Wade continued stroking the donkey's neck, feeling the tension in her muscles begin to ease under his gentle touch. "She's just hungry and cold. Look at her, she's not wild, just abandoned. She's also not your responsibility," Mrs. Henderson pointed out. "You've got enough to worry about with that big ranch of yours." But Wade was remembering Margaret's herb garden, her belief that every living thing deserved compassion. He was thinking about the empty spaces in his own life, the silence that filled his house each evening, the routine that had become more prison than comfort. Most of all, he was recognizing something in this donkey's quiet persistence that reflected his own stubborn refusal to give up, even when giving up might be easier. "Load her in the truck, Wade," he said to himself as much as to the others. "Just for tonight, until we figure out what else to do with her." The decision surprised him as much as it did the small crowd, but once made, it felt right in a way he couldn't explain. The donkey allowed herself to be led to his truck, stepping carefully up the loading ramp he'd used for sick calves. She settled in the truck bed as if she'd been riding in vehicles all her life, patient and dignified despite her circumstances. As Wade drove out of Elkhorn with his unlikely passenger, he caught sight of her in his rearview mirror. The donkey stood steady against the truck's movement, looking back at the town that had rejected her with what seemed like calm acceptance rather than bitterness. Just for tonight, Wade told himself, but something deep in his chest, in the place where loneliness had taken root, suggested that tonight might become something more. The stubborn old rancher and the unwanted donkey were heading home together, neither one knowing they were about to save each other's lives. The donkey stood quietly in the ranch yard, surveying her new surroundings with the careful attention of an animal assessing potential threats and opportunities. Wade climbed down from the truck cab and walked around to the tailgate, studying his unexpected guest in the clear afternoon light. Away from the shadows and garbage of town, she looked even more bedraggled, her grey coat patched with mud and thin from poor nutrition, her eyes holding the wary intelligence of a creature that had learned not to trust human intentions too readily. "Well," Wade said aloud, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air, "I suppose we need to figure out what to do with you." The donkey flicked her ears forward at the sound of his voice, a cautiously optimistic gesture that suggested she was willing to listen to whatever proposal he might have. Wade found himself oddly touched by that simple sign of trust from an animal that had every reason to expect disappointment from the world. Miguel Hernandez chose that moment to round the corner of the barn, leading Wade's stallion Thunder back from the day pasture. Miguel was a compact man in his 40s, weathered by years of outdoor work, but still strong and capable. He'd been Wade's foreman for 15 years, and in that time they'd developed the kind of professional relationship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of ranch operations. Miguel rarely questioned Wade's decisions, but the expression on his face as he took in the scene suggested this might be an exception. "Patron," Miguel said carefully, using the Spanish term of respect that had become habit between them. "You have acquired a burro." "Temporarily," Wade replied, though the word felt less certain than he'd intended. "Found her behind Murphy's store, going through garbage. Nobody claimed her, and animal control was going to put her down." Miguel secured Thunder in his stall and approached the truck with the professional eye of a man who'd evaluated thousands of animals over his career. He walked slowly around the donkey, noting her condition, her conformation, the way she held herself. His assessment was thorough and honest. "She is not in good condition," he observed. "Underweight, needs worming, probably has not seen a farrier in months. But the bone structure is good. Someone invested money in her breeding at one time." Wade nodded, grateful for Miguel's practical assessment. "I was thinking we could put her in the small paddock behind the barn, just until we figure out a permanent solution. See, that would work. But Patron," Miguel paused, choosing his words carefully, "a donkey is not a cattle. They have different needs, different behaviors, and this one, she's been alone too long. It may take time for her to trust again." The observation carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Miguel had an intuitive understanding of animal psychology, born from years of working with creatures that communicated through body language and behavior rather than words. If he thought the donkey would be difficult to rehabilitate, Wade should take that warning seriously. But as Wade looked at the animal standing patiently in his truck bed, he felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond the routine maintenance of his existing life. This donkey needed help, and he was in a position to provide it. The equation felt almost mathematical in its simplicity. "Let's get her settled," Wade said. "We can figure out the rest as we go." Together, they coaxed the donkey down from the truck and into the paddock Miguel had suggested. It was a small enclosure, originally built for injured horses that needed restricted movement during recovery. The shelter was three-sided, opening to the south for maximum sun exposure, with a water trough fed by automatic pipes and a hay manger that could be filled from outside the fence. The donkey explored her new quarters methodically, sniffing at the corners, testing the water with her lips, examining the hay Miguel had provided. Her movements were deliberate and cautious, the behavior of an animal that had learned to evaluate each new situation carefully before committing to trust. "She needs a name," Wade realized, watching her sample the hay with obvious hunger. The feed was high quality, far better than anything she'd found in town garbage cans, and she ate with the careful attention of someone who understood that good meals weren't guaranteed. Miguel smiled, the first genuine warmth Wade had seen from him since discovering the donkey. "My grandmother would call her Esperanza, hope. She always said animals that survive abandonment carry hope in their hearts, waiting for someone to see it." The suggestion was poetic and meaningful, but somehow didn't feel right to Wade. This donkey had something more stubborn than hope. She had determination, persistence, an unwillingness to surrender even when circumstances seemed hopeless. Those were qualities he understood, traits that resonated with his own approach to life's challenges. "What about Jasper?" he said, the name emerging from some corner of memory. "My grandfather had a mule named Jasper when I was young. Stubborn as a fence post, but reliable as sunrise." Miguel nodded approvingly. "Jasper, it is a good name for a determined animal." As if responding to the christening, the donkey looked up from her hay and regarded both men with what Wade could have sworn was acknowledgement. Her ears were pricked forward, alert but no longer fearful, and her tail switched once, not in annoyance but in what seemed like acceptance. Wade spent the next hour making sure Jasper had everything she needed for the night. Fresh water, plenty of hay, shelter from the wind that was beginning to pick up as evening approached. Miguel helped with practiced efficiency, but Wade noticed his foreman watching him with something that might have been concern. "Patron," Miguel said, as they finished securing the paddock gate, "may I speak plainly?" Wade nodded, prepared for practical objections about the cost and complication of caring for a donkey on a cattle ranch. "You have been alone too long," Miguel said simply. "We who work for you, we see this, and maybe this burro, she sees it too. Sometimes God sends us what we need in ways we do not expect." The observation was gentle but direct, carrying the wisdom of a man who understood that loneliness could be as dangerous as any physical ailment. Wade felt exposed, as if Miguel had glimpsed something he'd tried to keep hidden even from himself. "She's just staying until we find her a proper home," Wade said. But the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Miguel smiled again, this time with the knowing expression of someone who'd seen stubborn men rationalize decisions they'd already made in their hearts. "Si, patron." Just until then, as darkness settled over the ranch, Wade stood at his kitchen window, looking out at the small paddock where Jasper was finishing her evening hay. The donkey had found a spot near the shelter where she could see the house, and Wade found himself oddly comforted by her presence. For the first time in months, the ranch felt less empty, as if something that had been missing had quietly returned to its proper place. Just for tonight, he reminded himself. But already, he was planning improvements to the paddock, calculating feed costs, wondering if Jasper might benefit from companionship with some of the gentler cattle. The stubborn old rancher was already caring for his unlikely guest in ways that went far beyond temporary hospitality. 3 days later, Wade's morning routine had shifted in ways he hadn't consciously planned. After checking his grandfather's watch and pouring his first cup of coffee, he found himself walking to the kitchen window, not to survey his cattle in the distant pastures, but to check on the small grey figure in the paddock behind the barn. Jasper had established her own routine, standing near the fence at dawn, as if waiting for his appearance at the window. And Wade had begun to look forward to that moment of mutual recognition that started each day. Rosa Martinez arrived Thursday morning as usual, her compact sedan crunching up the gravel drive precisely at 8 o'clock. She was Miguel's sister-in-law, a woman in her 50s who'd been keeping Wade's house in order since Margaret's death. Rosa had strong opinions about most things and wasn't shy about sharing them, especially when she thought Wade was making decisions that went against his own best interests. She let herself in through the kitchen door and immediately noticed the changes to Wade's routine. Instead of sitting at the table reading his newspaper, he was standing at the sink, washing an extra feed bucket that hadn't been there the previous week. "You have acquired an animal," Rosa said, hanging her coat on the hook by the door. It wasn't a question. Rosa had an uncanny ability to detect any alteration in the household's equilibrium. "Temporarily," Wade replied, the same qualifier he'd been using since bringing Jasper home. "Found her in town, nobody wanted her. Just until I can find her a proper place." Rosa walked to the window and studied Jasper, who was methodically working her way through the morning hay Miguel had provided. Even from a distance, the donkey's condition had visibly improved. Her coat was cleaner, her movements less tentative, and she'd gained enough weight that her ribs no longer showed prominently. "She is a female," Rosa observed. "Janet, my grandfather kept burros when I was young. They are intelligent animals but stubborn. Once they decide to trust you, they trust completely. Once they decide not to trust, she shrugged expressively. Wade found himself curious about Rosa's assessment. In all the years she'd worked for him, their conversations had focused on household practicalities, cleaning schedules, grocery lists, maintenance needs. This was the most personal information she'd ever volunteered about her family history. What else did your grandfather say about them? He said they choose their person, not the other way around. A horse you can train to work for anyone who knows how to handle horses. But a burro, once it decides you are its person, it will not be happy with anyone else. Rosa's dark eyes studied Wade's face. Maybe this one has decided you are her person. The observation carried implications Wade wasn't ready to examine. He'd told himself repeatedly that Jasper's presence was temporary, a practical solution to an immediate problem. But he couldn't deny the satisfaction he felt when she looked up from her hay each morning, acknowledging his presence with a soft, nickering sound that had become part of the day's soundtrack. Later that morning, Wade drove back to town for supplies he'd forgotten during his previous trip: worming medication, hoof supplements, and a proper halter sized for a donkey rather than a horse. Sean Murphy greeted him with undisguised amusement. "Heard you took in that stray donkey," Sean said, ringing up the animal care supplies. "Maria's been talking about it all week. Says it's the most interesting thing to happen in Elkhorn since the Henderson twins, both married men, named Robert." Wade felt heat rise in his cheeks at the mention of Maria Gonzalez. He'd been meaning to stop by her restaurant for the past several days, but something about having Jasper at the ranch made him reluctant to discuss his personal life, even with someone as understanding as Maria. "Just helping out an animal in need," he said, focusing on organizing the supplies in his basket. "Nothing more complicated than that." Sean's knowing smile suggested he'd heard similar disclaimers before. "Maria mentioned you should stop by when you get a chance. She's been experimenting with a new recipe for sopapillas. Needs someone with a good palate to give her feedback." The invitation was clearly more than culinary, but Wade found himself oddly resistant to the implied social connection. For months, he'd been gradually warming to the possibility of companionship with Maria, drawn to her warmth and understanding of loss. But now, with Jasper at the ranch requiring attention and care, he felt reluctant to complicate his life with additional relationships. "Maybe next week," he said. Though they both knew next week would bring its own excuses, on the drive home, Wade reflected on his growing attachment to the donkey, despite his repeated claims that her presence was temporary. Each morning, he found himself checking on her before attending to any other ranch business. Each evening, he made sure she had adequate hay and fresh water before heading inside for dinner. The routine was becoming as automatic as his morning coffee or evening news. Miguel had noticed the changes too, though his observations came in the form of practical suggestions rather than commentary. The paddock gate needed better hardware to prevent Jasper from learning to open it herself. The water trough should be elevated slightly to reduce mud formation during spring thaw. The shelter could benefit from additional bedding now that winter was settling in more seriously. Each improvement felt reasonable and necessary. But Wade recognized that he was gradually making permanent modifications for what he continued to insist was a temporary arrangement. The cognitive dissonance bothered him, but not enough to change his behavior. Thursday evening, as Wade prepared his simple dinner of canned soup and grilled cheese, he found himself cooking extra portions without conscious thought. The surplus went to Jasper as a treat, supplementing her regular feed with warm, appealing flavors she clearly appreciated. Her enthusiastic response to these small gestures felt disproportionately rewarding. By Friday, Wade had to acknowledge that Jasper was thriving under his care. Her coat was developing the healthy sheen that indicated proper nutrition. Her eyes had lost the wary distance of an abandoned animal, replaced by alert interest in her surroundings. Most tellingly, she'd begun approaching the paddock fence whenever Wade appeared in the yard, seeking the gentle stroking and quiet words that had become part of their daily interactions. but it was Jasper's response to Rosa that truly demonstrated how much she'd changed. When the housekeeper approached the paddock to get a closer look at the ranch's newest resident, Jasper walked over immediately, allowing Rosa to scratch behind her ears while making the soft rumbling sounds that indicated contentment. "She trusts easily now," Rosa observed, continuing her gentle attention to the donkey's obvious pleasure. "This is good. It means she feels safe here, knows she will not be abandoned again." Wade watched the interaction between the two females with a mixture of pride and growing concern. Pride, because his care had clearly helped Jasper recover from her ordeal. Concern, because her obvious attachment to the ranch, to him, made the prospect of finding her another home increasingly complicated. As he stood there in the December sunshine, watching Rosa and Jasper develop their own relationship, Wade began to suspect that his repeated assurances about temporary arrangements were becoming less convincing to everyone involved, including himself. By the second week of December, Jasper had become an unofficial mascot for the ranch in ways Wade hadn't anticipated. Word of the wealthy rancher's unlikely rescue had spread through Elkhorn's informal communication network with the efficiency of small-town gossip, and the story had grown more romantic with each retelling. Wade discovered this when Dr. Sarah Chen, the veterinarian who served the valley's scattered ranches, arrived for Jasper's scheduled health check. "So you're the soft-hearted cowboy everyone's talking about," Dr. Chen said with a grin as she unloaded her mobile clinic from the back of her pickup truck. Sarah was a third-generation Chinese-American whose grandparents had settled in Montana during the railroad construction era. She'd returned to the valley after veterinary school, drawn by the same connection to land and community that kept most natives rooted despite economic opportunities elsewhere. Wade felt distinctly uncomfortable with the characterization. Just helped out an animal that needed help. Nothing more complicated than that. Sarah's professional examination of Jasper was thorough and encouraging. The donkey had gained nearly 40 pounds, her coat was developing proper winter thickness, and her general demeanor suggested an animal that felt secure and well cared for. More importantly, she'd bonded with Wade in ways that went beyond simple gratitude for food and shelter. "She's attached to you," Sarah observed, watching Jasper rest her head against Wade's shoulder while receiving her vaccinations. Donkeys form deep emotional connections with their caretakers, much more so than horses or cattle. "She's not just staying here because it's convenient. She's staying because she's chosen you as her person." The assessment echoed Rosa's earlier observation, but coming from a veterinarian with extensive experience in animal behavior, it carried additional weight. Wade stroked Jasper's neck absently, trying to ignore the warmth that spread through his chest at the thought of being chosen by this stubborn, determined creature. "What happens when I find her a permanent home?" he asked, though the question felt increasingly hypothetical. Sarah packed her instruments carefully before answering. "That would depend on several factors. Her age, the quality of care she'd receive elsewhere, how well she adapted to new surroundings. But honestly, Wade, she's middle-aged for a donkey, set in her ways and clearly bonded to you. Most people looking for a donkey want something younger, more trainable. Finding her another situation that would make her happy might be more difficult than you think." After Sarah left, Wade found himself sitting on an upturned feed bucket in Jasper's paddock, watching her investigate a new salt lick he'd installed that morning. The December sun was weak but warm on his back, and the familiar sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing in distant pastures, wind moving through the barn's metal roof, created a peaceful backdrop for uncomfortable introspection. The truth was that he'd stopped actively looking for alternative homes for Jasper. He'd made a few half-hearted inquiries among neighboring ranchers, but hadn't followed up when their responses were lukewarm. Nobody needed a middle-aged donkey, especially one that came with an unknown history and potential behavioral quirks. But if he was honest with himself, Wade wasn't particularly motivated to find alternatives. Jasper's presence had filled a void in his daily routine that he hadn't fully recognized until she'd arrived to occupy it. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted his contemplation. A familiar blue sedan was making its way up the long gravel drive, Tommy Martinez delivering the afternoon mail. But instead of leaving the mail in the box at the road's end and departing, Tommy parked near the house and climbed out with obvious curiosity about the ranch's new resident. "Mr. Thatcher," Tommy called, approaching the paddock with the confident stride of a teenager who'd grown up around ranch animals. "Heard you took in that donkey from behind Murphy's store. Mind if I take a look?" Wade gestured toward the paddock, where Jasper had moved to the fence line to investigate their visitor. Tommy approached with the easy familiarity of someone who understood animal behavior, extending his hand for Jasper to scent before attempting any physical contact. "She's in good condition," Tommy observed, running his hands along Jasper's neck and shoulders with surprising expertise. "My uncle raises mules down in New Mexico. Always said donkeys were smarter than horses, just less interested in showing off about it." "You know animals," Wade said, impressed by the young man's confident handling of Jasper. Tommy nodded. "Grew up around them. My family's had livestock for 3 generations, but we lost the ranch when I was 12. Bank foreclosure. That's why I deliver papers now, saving money for college, hoping to study agriculture and maybe get back into ranching someday." The explanation carried the matter-of-fact sadness of someone who'd learned early that life didn't always honor dreams or reward hard work. Wade recognized the combination of pragmatism and hope that characterized most ranch families, the understanding that setbacks were inevitable, but the determination to keep working toward long-term goals. "What are you planning to study?" Wade asked, genuinely curious about the young man's ambitions. "Ranch management, animal science, maybe some business courses. Figure if I'm going to get back into livestock, I better understand all aspects of the operation. Too many good ranchers lose everything because they don't understand the financial side." Wade nodded approvingly. The observation showed maturity beyond Tommy's years, an understanding that successful ranching required more than just skill with animals. That's smart thinking. Too many operations fail because they focus only on the cattle and ignore the business fundamentals. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle, Rosa's sedan, returning for some forgotten cleaning supplies. But instead of heading directly to the house, Rosa approached the paddock where Wade and Tommy were discussing ranch economics while Jasper listened with apparent interest. "Tommy Martinez," Rosa said warmly. "How is your mother?" "She's well, Mrs. Martinez. Still working at the school district. Still hoping I'll find a nice girl and give her grandchildren to spoil." Rosa laughed, the sound carrying genuine affection for the earnest young man. "Mothers are the same everywhere, always worried their children aren't settling down fast enough." Wade watched this easy interaction between 2 generations of the Valley's Hispanic community, feeling both included and separate from their shared cultural context. Rosa and Tommy spoke with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd known each other's families for decades, who understood without explanation the pressures and expectations that shaped each other's choices. "Mr. Thatcher's been telling me about the donkey," Tommy said, scratching behind Jasper's ears. "She seems to have settled in well here." "She has chosen him," Rosa replied with certainty. "Just as I predicted. Burros know good people, and they do not easily change their minds once they have decided to trust." Tommy looked thoughtful. "My uncle always said donkeys were the best judges of character in the animal kingdom. Said if a donkey trusted you, it was because you deserved it." Wade felt distinctly self-conscious under this dual assessment of his character based on Jasper's apparent approval. But he couldn't deny the pleasure he took in their assumption that her attachment reflected something positive about his fundamental nature. For too many years, he'd measured himself primarily by external achievements: the success of his ranch, the respect of his peers, the accumulation of assets that would outlast his lifetime. The idea that he might be worthy of simple, uncomplicated affection from a creature who asked for nothing more than decent treatment felt unexpectedly meaningful. The following Saturday brought an unexpected visitor that forced Wade to confront how much his life had changed since Jasper's arrival. Maria Gonzalez pulled up in her reliable Honda Accord just as Wade was finishing his morning chores, carrying a covered dish that filled the air with the scent of green chile and warm tortillas when she stepped out of the car. Maria was 58. With silver threading through black hair she wore in a practical braid, and the kind of understated elegance that came from confidence rather than effort. She'd owned the small restaurant in Elkhorn for 15 years since her husband's death from a heart attack left her needing to support herself and find purpose beyond grief. Wade had been attracted to her quiet strength for months, but had never found the courage to act on that attraction. "I heard about your donkey," Maria said without preamble, setting the covered dish on his porch steps. "Thought I'd bring lunch and see this famous Jasper everyone's talking about." Wade felt heat rise in his cheeks at the implication that his personal life had become a topic of community discussion. "She's not really mine. Just helping her out until I find her a proper home." Maria's knowing smile suggested she'd heard this explanation before and found it about as convincing as everyone else did. "Of course. Where is this temporary guest of yours?" They walked to the paddock together, and Wade watched Maria's face as she got her first close look at Jasper. The donkey approached the fence immediately, drawn by Maria's calm energy and perhaps the lingering sense of her kitchen that clung to her clothes. Maria extended her hand for Jasper to sniff, then began the gentle stroking that the donkey had learned to expect from visitors. "She's beautiful," Maria said softly, and Wade could hear genuine affection in her voice. Margaret would have loved her. The mention of his late wife caught Wade off guard. Few people spoke of Margaret anymore, as if her memory had become too delicate for casual conversation. But Maria had been Margaret's cousin, had shared childhood memories and family traditions that created bonds beyond simple friendship. Her easy reference to Margaret felt both painful and comforting. "Margaret always did have a soft spot for strays," Wade replied, remembering his wife's tendency to bring home injured birds and abandoned kittens. "She would have had Jasper spoiled rotten by now." "She would have had you spoiled rotten too," Maria said with gentle humor. "Margaret worried about you, even before she got sick. Said you were too willing to carry the world on your shoulders without asking for help." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in memories of the woman who'd connected them in life, and whose absence had created the careful distance they'd maintained since her death. Jasper seemed to sense the emotional weight of their conversation, resting her head against Maria's shoulder in a gesture of simple comfort. "She's attached to you," Maria observed, watching Jasper's obvious contentment with the human contact. "Animals always know who they can trust. Margaret used to say that about you, that animals and children could sense your good heart even when you tried to hide it behind all that rancher stoicism." Wade found himself simultaneously pleased and uncomfortable with this assessment. The idea that Margaret had seen and appreciated qualities in him that he wasn't sure he possessed felt both validating and burdening. Living up to a dead woman's faith in his character seemed like an impossible standard. "Would you like to stay for lunch?" he asked, gesturing toward the covered dish Maria had brought. "I mean, since you went to the trouble of cooking." "I'd like that very much," Maria replied, and Wade was surprised by how much her acceptance pleased him. They ate on the porch, despite the December cold, bundled in coats and warmed by coffee that Maria pronounced adequate but uninspired. The meal was simple: enchiladas with green chile, Spanish rice, beans that had been simmered with cumin and garlic until they achieved the perfect balance of flavor and texture. Wade hadn't tasted home cooking this good since Margaret's death, and he found himself savoring not just the food, but the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with someone whose company he genuinely enjoyed. "How long since you've had people over?" Maria asked, watching him eat with obvious appreciation. Wade considered the question carefully. "Rosa comes twice a week. Miguel and I eat lunch together sometimes during busy seasons, but actual social meals? Not since Margaret's funeral reception. That's too long," Maria said simply. "People aren't meant to be that alone, especially people who have as much to offer as you do." The observation was gentle but direct, carrying the weight of someone who understood loneliness from her own experience. Wade felt exposed under her steady gaze, as if she could see through the careful routines and practical focus he'd used to structure his solitary life. "I've gotten used to the quiet," he said. Though even as he spoke the words, he recognized them as only partially true. Jasper's presence had reminded him how much he'd missed, having another living being depend on him, respond to his care, share the daily rhythms of ranch life. "There's a difference between choosing solitude and having it forced on you," Maria replied. "Margaret used to say you were naturally social, but too proud to admit you needed other people's company." Before Wade could respond to this uncomfortable insight, they were interrupted by the sound of another approaching vehicle. A battered pickup truck was making its way up the drive, followed by a dust cloud that suggested urgent business. Wade recognized the truck as belonging to Bill Henderson, whose ranch bordered his property to the east. Bill climbed out of the truck looking agitated, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious distress. He was a man in his 70s, a widower who'd been ranching the valley longer than anyone except Wade's family. If Bill Henderson was upset enough to make an unannounced visit, something serious was wrong. "Wade," Bill called without his usual casual greeting. "Sorry to interrupt your lunch, but I need to talk to you." "It's about your donkey." Wade felt his stomach tighten with sudden apprehension. "What about Jasper?" "She belongs to my granddaughter Emma," Bill said, his voice heavy with reluctant revelation. "Emma's been looking for that donkey since October, when she escaped from their place down in Colorado. Emma's been sick, real sick, and that donkey was her therapy animal. I just found out yesterday that the donkey they've been searching for matches the description of the one you took in." The words hit Wade like a physical blow. In all his speculation about Jasper's origins, he'd never considered that she might belong to a child, might be missed, and desperately sought by someone who needed her more than he did. The careful world he'd been building around his unlikely companion suddenly felt fragile and temporary in ways he hadn't prepared himself to face. Maria reached over and took his hand, a gesture of support that reminded him he wasn't alone in dealing with this unexpected complication. But her touch couldn't ease the growing certainty that his time with Jasper, and perhaps his chance at finding connection again, was about to come to an abrupt end. Bill Henderson removed his hat and ran his fingers through thinning grey hair, a gesture Wade recognized as the prelude to difficult conversations. The older rancher's weathered face carried the weight of someone delivering news he'd rather not share, but couldn't in good conscience withhold. "Tell me about Emma," Wade said quietly, dreading the answer but needing to understand the full scope of what he was facing. Bill settled onto the porch steps beside Maria, looking out at Jasper, who continued grazing peacefully, unaware that her future was being decided. "Emma's my son Robert's daughter. She's 12 years old, lives with her mother down in Durango. Sweet kid, always loved animals more than most people." He paused, struggling with the emotional weight of the story. "Last spring, Emma was diagnosed with juvenile diabetes. Severe case, requires constant monitoring, multiple insulin shots daily. But that wasn't the worst of it." Wade felt Maria's hand tighten in his, both of them sensing the tragedy that was coming. "The diabetes triggered some kind of anxiety disorder," Bill continued. "Emma started having panic attacks, couldn't sleep, wouldn't go to school. The doctors tried medication, therapy, everything they could think of. Nothing worked until they suggested a therapy animal. That's when they found Jasper." The revelation hit Wade with unexpected force. All this time, he'd assumed Jasper had been abandoned, discarded by people who no longer wanted the responsibility of caring for her. The image he'd carried of her former owners, careless, indifferent people who'd let her wander away, collapsed under the weight of this new reality. "Jasper wasn't abandoned," Wade said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Lord, no. That donkey was Emma's lifeline. Somehow, she could sense when Emma's blood sugar was getting dangerous, would alert the family before the monitors even registered a problem. More than that, though, Jasper gave Emma something to focus on besides her illness. The girl learned to manage her diabetes, because she wanted to take care of her donkey. Wade looked at Jasper with new eyes, seeing not just the stubborn, determined animal he'd grown to love, but a creature whose instincts and training had been honed to save a child's life. The quiet intelligence he'd admired, the way she seemed to sense human emotions and respond appropriately, these weren't just personality traits, but the result of specialized training and a bond forged in medical necessity. How did she end up here? Maria asked gently, her voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that came from years of helping people work through difficult situations. Bill's expression darkened with guilt and regret. That's the part that makes this whole mess my fault. Back in October, I was visiting Robert and Emma down in Colorado. Emma was doing so well, managing her diabetes back in school, just like a normal kid again. And it was all because of that donkey. He paused, gathering himself for the confession Wade could see coming. Emma wanted to bring Jasper up here to meet me, show off how well-trained she was, how much progress they'd made together. Robert wasn't sure about transporting a donkey that far, but Emma begged, and she'd been through so much already. So we loaded Jasper in a trailer and drove up to my place. Wade could feel his stomach sinking as the story unfolded, understanding now how Jasper had ended up wandering the mountains of Montana instead of staying safely in Colorado. The first night at my ranch there was a storm. Lightning spooked the cattle, and in the confusion someone left a gate open. Jasper got out with a few head of cattle, and by the time we realized what had happened, she was gone. We searched for days, Robert, Emma, myself, half the neighbors. Found the cattle within a few hours, but Jasper had vanished completely. The image of a sick child searching desperately for her therapy animal. Knowing that her health and emotional stability depended on that connection, cut Wade deeper than he'd expected. Emma's loss recontextualized everything he'd experienced with Jasper. The donkey's wariness, her gradual trust, her obvious relief at finding safety and care. She hadn't been abandoned. She'd been lost and trying to find her way home to a girl who needed her desperately. Emma's been asking about Jasper every day since October, Bill continued, his voice heavy with grandfather's guilt. Her anxiety came back worse than before. She's had to go back to intensive medical monitoring because Jasper isn't there to alert the family about blood sugar changes. The doctors say the stress of losing her therapy animal has actually made her diabetes harder to control. Wade stood abruptly and walked to the paddock fence, needing space to process the implications of Bill's revelation. Jasper approached the fence, as she always did when he appeared, resting her head against his chest in the gesture of affection that had become routine between them. The simple trust in that gesture now carried painful overtones. This wasn't his donkey to love, but a child's lifeline that had been temporarily misplaced. "You have to take her back to Emma," Wade said, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. "That little girl needs her more than I do." "It's not that simple," Bill replied sadly. "Emma's mother won't let her travel back up here, not after what happened the first time. And I'm too old to be making that drive to Colorado every time they want to visit. But Emma keeps asking when Jasper's coming home, and I don't know what to tell her." Maria stood and joined Wade at the fence, her presence offering comfort he didn't know how to ask for directly. "What about bringing Emma up here?" she suggested. "If the weather holds, if her doctors approve the travel, maybe she could come for a visit. See Jasper. Know that she's safe and well cared for." The suggestion offered a compromise that Wade hadn't considered, but it also forced him to confront the depth of his attachment to the donkey. Over the past weeks, Jasper had become more than just an animal he was caring for. She'd become a catalyst for reconnecting with his community, a reason to look forward to each day's routine, a companion whose simple presence had eased the loneliness he'd carried since Margaret's death. What would happen after the visit? Wade asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it spoken. Bill's expression was sympathetic but firm. Emma would want to take Jasper home, back to Colorado where she belongs. That donkey is the difference between Emma living a normal life and being a prisoner to her medical condition. As much as I can see how attached you've become to her, we can't ask a sick child to sacrifice her health for anyone else's happiness. The moral equation was stark and unavoidable. A 12-year-old girl's medical and emotional needs outweighed his own desire for companionship, no matter how profound that companionship had become. But acknowledging the right choice didn't make it less painful to contemplate. When would Emma be able to visit? Wade asked, surprised by his own willingness to consider the arrangement that would ultimately cost him Jasper's presence. Her mother says maybe over Christmas break. If Emma's blood sugar stabilizes, and if the doctors think the trip won't be too stressful, it would only be for a few days, just long enough for Emma to see that Jasper is safe and to prepare for taking her home. Wade nodded slowly, feeling the weight of decisions that seemed to make themselves despite his emotional resistance. Tell Emma she can come whenever she's ready. Jasper will be here waiting for her. As Bill Henderson drove away, carrying the promise that would ultimately separate Wade from the companion who'd changed his life, Wade found himself facing the profound irony of his situation. In learning to love Jasper, he'd rediscovered his capacity for connection and care. But loving her also meant accepting that she belonged elsewhere, with someone who needed her more desperately than he ever could. Maria took his hand as they stood watching Jasper resume her peaceful grazing, both of them understanding that the next few weeks would test more than just Wade's attachment to a donkey. They would test his ability to choose generosity over self-interest, to find meaning in temporary connections, and to trust that doing the right thing might somehow lead to unexpected forms of healing. The stubborn old rancher was about to learn that sometimes the greatest act of love was learning when to let go. The week before, Emma's scheduled arrival passed, with the deliberate intensity of a man preparing for a battle he knew he couldn't win. Wade threw himself into making the ranch as welcoming as possible for a sick 12-year-old, though every improvement felt like another step toward saying goodbye to the companion who'd transformed his daily existence. He started with practical considerations. Emma would need a place to stay that was comfortable and close enough to Jasper for easy visits. The guest bedroom had remained largely unused since Margaret's death, but Rosa helped him prepare it with fresh linens, a space heater to counter the December cold, and small touches that might appeal to a young girl. Books borrowed from the town library, a comfortable reading chair positioned near the window that overlooked Jasper's paddock. "You are making this harder on yourself than it needs to be," Rosa observed, watching Wade arrange and rearrange the room's furniture with the nervous energy of someone avoiding deeper thoughts. "The child will stay only a few days, and then you will go back to your quiet life." Wade paused in his adjustments to the window blinds, struck by Rosa's assumption that losing Jasper would simply return him to his previous existence. The past month had changed him in ways he was still discovering, had awakened needs and capacities he'd forgotten he possessed. Going back to his solitary routine felt less like returning to normalcy than like accepting a kind of emotional exile. "I don't think it's going to be that simple," he admitted. Perhaps the most honest thing he'd said about his situation since Bill Henderson's revelation. Rosa studied his face with the perceptive attention of someone who'd watched him grieve Margaret's death and slowly build walls against further loss. "No," she agreed softly. "I do not think it will be simple either, but maybe that is not a bad thing." Miguel proved equally supportive in his practical way, helping Wade improve Jasper's living conditions so that Emma would see how well her therapy animal had been cared for during their separation. Together, they expanded the paddock, added better drainage, and constructed a more comfortable shelter that would protect Jasper from winter weather, whether she stayed or left. "You want the girl to see that Jasper has been loved here," Miguel observed, watching Wade apply a final coat of stain to the shelter's wooden walls. "This is good. It will help her trust that leaving Jasper with you was not abandonment." The comment revealed Miguel's awareness that Wade was hoping against hope that Emma might decide to leave Jasper at the ranch, at least temporarily. It was a selfish wish, Wade knew, but one he couldn't entirely suppress, despite his rational understanding that Emma needed her therapy animal more than he needed companionship. Maria visited daily during that week, sometimes bringing food, sometimes just offering the quiet companionship that had become precious to Wade as he faced the prospect of returning to solitude. Her presence reminded him that his connection to Jasper had been the catalyst for reconnecting with other people as well, that losing the donkey didn't have to mean losing everything he'd gained during their time together. "How are you holding up?" Maria asked on Wednesday evening, settling beside him on the porch where they'd taken to sharing coffee after dinner. The December air was sharp with coming snow, but both of them seemed reluctant to end their time together by going indoors. "I keep telling myself I'm doing the right thing," Wade replied, watching Jasper move around her paddock with the careful attention of someone memorizing details he might not see again. "Emma needs her more than I do. That's the simple truth of the situation." "Simple truths and easy choices aren't always the same thing," Maria observed. "Margaret used to say you had a gift for making the right decision even when it cost you personally. She was proud of that quality, but also worried it meant you'd sacrifice your own happiness too easily." Wade considered this assessment of his character, wondering if Margaret had been right to worry. The decision to let Emma take Jasper back to Colorado was obviously correct from any objective standpoint. A child's medical needs outweighed an adult's desire for companionship. But acknowledging that correctness didn't ease the loss he was anticipating, "What would you do?" he asked Maria, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Exactly what you're doing," she replied without hesitation. "But I'd also be honest about how much it was going to hurt. And I'd make sure I had reasons to keep moving forward after it was over." The suggestion that he needed plans beyond simply enduring Emma's visit forced Wade to confront questions he'd been avoiding. What would his life look like after Jasper left? Would he retreat back into the careful isolation that had characterized the years since Margaret's death? Or would he find ways to maintain the connections that caring for Jasper had helped him build? Thursday brought Dr. Sarah Chen for what she diplomatically called a pre-travel examination for Jasper. Though everyone understood it was really an assessment of whether the donkey was healthy enough for the journey to Colorado. Sarah's examination was thorough and encouraging. Jasper had not only recovered from her weeks of wandering and poor nutrition, but had actually improved beyond her condition before getting lost. She's gained weight. Her coat is thick and healthy, and her overall fitness is excellent, Sarah reported. Whatever Emma was doing for her medical training, it's clear she learned to take exceptional care of this animal. And whatever you've been doing has only improved on that foundation. Wade felt simultaneously proud and heartbroken by this assessment. He'd succeeded in caring for Jasper, had given her everything she needed to thrive. But that success also meant there were no medical reasons to delay her return to Emma, no complications that might require extended treatment at the ranch. "How do you think she'll handle the separation?" Wade asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand what Jasper might experience when they parted. Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "Donkeys form deep attachments, and she's clearly bonded with you. She'll experience stress when that relationship changes. But she's also been trained to bond with Emma specifically, and she'll remember that connection once they're reunited. Animals are often more adaptable than we give them credit for." Friday evening brought unexpected visitors that reminded Wade how much his situation had affected the broader community. Tommy Martinez arrived just after dinner, but instead of delivering mail, he carried a carefully wrapped package and an expression of serious purpose. "Mr. Thatcher," Tommy said formally, "I wanted to give you something before Emma arrives." The package contained a hand-carved wooden halter that Tommy had made in his high school shop class, sized specifically for Jasper, and decorated with simple but elegant designs that reflected traditional ranching craftsmanship. The workmanship was impressive, showing both skill and genuine affection for the project. "I thought Emma should have something special to remember how well Jasper was cared for while she was away," Tommy explained. "And maybe something to remember you by, too." The gesture touched Wade more deeply than he'd expected. This young man, saving money for college and planning his return to ranching, had invested time and effort in creating something beautiful for a girl he'd never met, simply because he understood the emotional weight of the situation. This is beautiful work. Tommy, Emma will treasure it. I hope so, Tommy replied. And Mr. Thatcher? What you're doing, letting Emma have her donkey back even though you've gotten attached. That's the kind of thing my uncle always said separated good ranchers from great ones. Great ranchers understand that sometimes the land and animals don't belong to us. We just get to take care of them for a while. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made the mountains stand out in sharp relief against a brilliant blue sky. Wade rose earlier than usual, checking his grandfather's pocket watch by habit, before realizing that this might be one of the last mornings he'd follow his established routine. Tomorrow, Emma would arrive and everything would change. He spent extra time with Jasper, brushing her coat until it gleamed, checking her hooves, making sure she looked her absolute best for the reunion with the girl who'd been searching for her since October. Jasper seemed to sense something different about the day, staying closer to Wade than usual, occasionally nuzzling his shoulder in the gesture of affection that had become their private communication. Tomorrow, a girl, Wade said softly, running his hands along her neck one more time. Tomorrow, you get to go home to someone who needs you more than I do. But even as he spoke the words, Wade realized that his definition of home had changed over the past month. Home was no longer just the ranch he'd inherited, the land he'd worked, the house he'd shared with Margaret. Home had become the daily rhythm of caring for another living being, the simple pleasure of companionship, the knowledge that his presence mattered to someone who depended on him. Losing Jasper wouldn't just mean losing a beloved animal. It would mean losing his sense of purpose, his reason to look forward to each day's routine, his connection to the possibility that his life could still hold unexpected sources of joy. As he stood in the December sunshine, watching Jasper graze peacefully in the paddock he'd improved for her comfort, Wade Thatcher prepared himself for the most difficult act of love he'd ever contemplated, giving up something precious, for the sake of someone who needed it more. Emma. Henderson Torres arrived on Sunday morning in a silver SUV that kicked up dust, clouds, as it navigated the long gravel drive to Wade's house. Wade watched from his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hands as the vehicle parked near the porch. His stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Anticipation for Emma's reunion with Jasper, dread for his own impending loss. The first person out of the SUV was a woman in her mid-30s with Emma's dark hair and Bill Henderson's determined jaw. She moved with the careful alertness of a mother accustomed to monitoring her child's medical condition, her eyes immediately scanning the ranch buildings as if assessing potential complications or hazards. Emma emerged more slowly, a slight girl who seemed younger than her 12 years, until you noticed the medical alert bracelet on her wrist and the small testing kit she carried like a purse. She wore jeans and boots that suggested familiarity with ranch life, but her movements had the cautious quality of someone whose body had taught her not to trust its reliability. Bill Henderson climbed out last, looking older and more fragile than Wade remembered from their conversation the previous week. The guilt of losing his granddaughter's therapy animal had clearly weighed heavily on him, aging him in ways that went beyond simple time passage. Wade stepped onto the porch as the family approached, feeling awkwardly formal in his pressed shirt and best jeans. He'd agonized over how to dress for this meeting, wanting to make a good impression on Emma while not overdressing for a ranch visit. The result felt like a compromise that satisfied no one, least of all himself. "You must be Mr. Thatcher," Emma's mother said, extending her hand with a smile that didn't quite hide her underlying worry. "I'm Lisa Torres, Emma's mom. Thank you for taking such good care of Jasper." "She's been no trouble at all," Wade replied, the familiar understatement feeling particularly hollow given how much Jasper's presence had transformed his life. "She's a remarkable animal." But Emma wasn't listening to the adult pleasantries. Her attention had locked onto the paddock behind the barn, where Jasper stood at the fence, ears pricked forward, as if she recognized something familiar about the approaching voices. The girl's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that reminded Wade why he was doing the right thing, even if it cost him everything he'd gained over the past month. "Jasper!" Emma called, her voice carrying across the ranch yard with the excitement of someone spotting a beloved friend after a long separation. "Jasper, it's me." The donkey's response was immediate and unmistakable. She began moving toward the paddock gate with purposeful steps, making the soft, nickering sounds Wade had learned to associate with contentment and recognition. But these sounds were different, more urgent, more joyful, carrying emotional weight that spoke to a connection deeper than anything Wade had achieved with her. Emma ran toward the paddock, despite her mother's cautioned, "Be careful, honey," moving with the focused determination of someone whose world had suddenly become complete again. Wade followed more slowly, feeling like an observer to a reunion that highlighted his own role as temporary caretaker rather than chosen companion. The moment Emma reached the fence, Jasper pressed her head through the rails, seeking the physical contact she'd been denied for 3 months. Emma wrapped her arms around the donkey's neck, pressing her face against the rough coat, and Wade could see tears streaming down her cheeks. "I missed you so much," Emma whispered, her words barely audible, but carrying the weight of genuine anguish. "I thought I'd never see you again. I thought you were gone forever." Jasper remained perfectly still, allowing Emma's embrace while making soft sounds that seemed designed to comfort and reassure. Wade watched this interaction with growing understanding of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just affection between a girl and her pet, but a medical partnership built on mutual dependence and trust. "She remembers you," Wade observed, struck by the immediate intimacy of their reunion. Emma looked up at him for the first time, her eyes bright with tears and gratitude. "She's my best friend," the girl said simply. "She knows when my blood sugar gets dangerous before I do. She saved my life more times than I can count." Lisa Torres approached the fence, carrying the testing kit Emma had left behind in her excitement. "Emma needs to check her levels," she explained to Wade. "The excitement of traveling and seeing Jasper again can cause spikes." Wade watched as Emma efficiently performed her blood sugar test, a routine so automatic it barely interrupted her attention to Jasper. The donkey stood quietly during the procedure, as if understanding its importance, then gently nuzzled Emma's hand when she finished. "Perfect numbers," Emma announced with satisfaction. "Jasper always makes me feel better." The simple statement carried profound implications. This wasn't just a child's emotional attachment to a beloved pet. It was a medical relationship that directly affected Emma's ability to manage a life-threatening condition. Wade's month of caring for Jasper had been meaningful, but Emma's need for her was literally a matter of survival. "She looks wonderful," Lisa said, studying Jasper with the careful attention of someone evaluating medical equipment. "You've taken excellent care of her, Mr. Thatcher. I can't tell you how grateful we are." Wade nodded, accepting the gratitude he knew he deserved, while simultaneously recognizing that his time as Jasper's caretaker was coming to an end. Emma belonged with this donkey in ways that went beyond simple affection or even companionship. They were partners in managing a medical condition that required their absolute trust in each other. Standing there in the December sunshine, watching Emma and Jasper re-establish their vital connection, Wade began to understand that loving something sometimes meant recognizing when someone else needed it more than you did. The afternoon unfolded with the bittersweet intensity of a perfect day that everyone knows will end too soon. Emma spent hours in the paddock with Jasper, re-establishing routines and commands that the donkey remembered perfectly despite their 3-month separation. Wade watched from various vantage points around the ranch, simultaneously proud of how well he'd cared for Jasper and heartbroken by the evidence of how much she'd missed her true companion. Emma's expertise with Jasper was immediately apparent. She led the donkey through exercises Wade had never seen, specific behaviors that allowed Jasper to detect blood sugar changes, alert patterns that could summon help when Emma was in medical distress. calming techniques that helped manage anxiety attacks. This wasn't just a girl playing with her pet, but a young woman working with her medical partner. "She's incredible," Maria said softly, joining Wade by the paddock fence as Emma demonstrated how Jasper could retrieve testing supplies on command. "I've never seen anything like this," Wade nodded, unable to trust his voice as he watched Emma and Jasper work together with the seamless coordination of a team that had trained together through countless hours of repetition and trust. Every interaction between them reinforced what he'd begun to understand, that his month with Jasper had been meaningful, but it was nothing compared to the life-sustaining partnership she'd built with Emma. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the ranch yard, Wade realized he needed to have a conversation he'd been dreading all day. Emma was sitting cross-legged in the paddock, brushing Jasper's coat with careful strokes, while talking to her in the low, continuous murmur that seemed to be their private communication. "Emma," Wade said, approaching the fence carefully so as not to startle either girl or donkey. "Could I talk to you for a few minutes?" Emma looked up from her brushing, her face showing the peaceful contentment of someone who'd been reunited with something essential to her well-being. "Sure, Mr. Thatcher. Thank you again for taking such good care of Jasper. I can tell she's been really happy here." Wade felt a stab of pain at her gratitude, knowing what he was about to say would change the dynamic between them. "Emma, I need to be honest with you about something. When your grandfather told me about your situation, about how much you need Jasper, I agreed that she should go home with you to Colorado. That's still what needs to happen. You need her more than I do, and she belongs with you." Emma's expression grew cautious, sensing something difficult in Wade's tone, despite his supportive words. "But I have to tell you," Wade continued, "that having Jasper here this past month has meant more to me than I expected. I lost my wife a few years ago, and I'd gotten used to being alone. Jasper reminded me what it felt like to have someone to care for, someone who depended on me. I'm going to miss her more than I probably should." Emma studied his face with the serious attention of someone who'd learned early to read adult emotions and motivations. "You love her too," she said simply. "I do," Wade admitted, surprised by how much easier it was to say the words once he'd committed to honesty. "But loving her means wanting what's best for her, and what's best for her is being with you." Emma was quiet for a long moment, continuing to brush Jasper's coat while processing Wade's confession. When she spoke again, her voice carried a maturity beyond her 12 years. "My mum says love isn't about keeping things. It's about helping them be where they need to be," she said. "Jasper needs to be with me because I'm sick, and she helps keep me alive. But she was happy here with you, wasn't she?" "I think so," Wade replied, touched by Emma's ability to acknowledge his loss while understanding her own needs. "She seemed content. Then maybe love can be about sharing too," Emma suggested, her voice growing more confident as she worked through her thoughts. "Maybe Jasper could come visit you sometimes, when I'm feeling good, and Mom says it's okay to travel. And maybe you could come visit us in Colorado, see how she's doing." Wade felt something shift in his chest at Emma's proposal, not the complete resolution he'd been hoping for, but something better than the permanent separation he'd been dreading. The idea that his relationship with Jasper might continue in some form, that Emma understood and valued the bond he'd formed with her therapy animal, offered a kind of hope he hadn't allowed himself to consider. "I'd like that very much," Wade said. "Meaning it completely." Emma smiled, the first completely unclouded expression of joy Wade had seen from her all day. "Good, because Jasper's going to miss you too. And she gets cranky when she misses people she loves." As if responding to her name and the emotional weight of the conversation, Jasper moved closer to the fence where Wade stood, resting her head against his chest in the gesture of affection that had become their private ritual. For a moment, the three of them stood connected, Wade, Emma, and the donkey, who had taught them both something important about the nature of love and letting go. "Thank you, Mr. Thatcher," Emma said quietly, "for everything." Wade stroked Jasper's neck one more time, feeling the warmth of her coat and the steady rhythm of her breathing. "Tomorrow, She would begin the journey back to Colorado, back to the girl whose life she helped sustain. But today, in this moment, she belonged to all of them, a bridge between loneliness and connection, between keeping and sharing, between the love that holds on and the love that lets go. 3 months later, Wade Thatcher stood on his wraparound porch, watching the sunrise paint the distant peaks in shades of gold and crimson. But his morning routine had changed in ways that would have surprised his earlier self. Instead of solitary coffee and silent contemplation, he was expecting company. Maria would arrive within the hour for the breakfast she'd been sharing with him twice a week since. Emma took Jasper back to Colorado. The empty paddock behind the barn no longer felt like a wound. Wade had converted it into a workshop where Tommy Martinez came after school to learn traditional ranching skills while earning money for college. The young man was proving as reliable and determined as Wade had hoped, and their conversations filled the afternoon air with discussions of cattle breeding, land management, and the business aspects of modern ranching that would serve Tommy well when he eventually started his own operation. Wade pulled his grandfather's silver-trimmed pocket watch from his vest, noting that the familiar weight felt different now, less like a burden of solitary legacy and more like a connection to the future he was helping shape. 6:15, the same time he'd risen for 40 years. But the solitude that had once anchored his days had been replaced by anticipation of the connections that now structured his weeks. The coffee pot still percolated in the kitchen, but Maria had brought a superior blend from her restaurant, and Wade had learned to appreciate the difference. Her presence in his house no longer felt foreign or temporary. She'd earned her place through patience, understanding, and the kind of easy companionship that reminded him daily why Margaret had loved her cousin so deeply. Rosa Martinez continued her twice-weekly visits, but her observations about Wade's character had shifted from concerned warnings about isolation to approving comments about his willingness to embrace change. "You are different now," she'd said the previous week, lighter somehow, as if you remembered that joy does not diminish with age. The transformation hadn't been simple or immediate. The first weeks after Emma's departure had tested Wade's resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. The silence of the empty paddock, the absence of daily animal care routines, the return to solitary meals, all of it had emphasized how much. His brief time with Jasper had changed his fundamental relationship with loneliness, but the connections he'd made during that month had proven more durable than he'd expected. Maria's friendship had deepened into something that honored both Margaret's memory and Wade's capacity for new love. Tommy's apprenticeship had given Wade a sense of purpose that went beyond ranch maintenance. Even his relationship with Miguel had evolved, becoming less formal and more genuinely collaborative. Most importantly, his connection to Emma and Jasper had continued through regular phone calls, letters, and the photographs Emma sent showing her therapy animals' ongoing adventures in Colorado. The pictures revealed a healthy, happy donkey who clearly thrived in her essential role as Emma's medical partner, confirming that Wade had made the right choice even when it had been the most difficult one. The sound of Maria's Honda Accord crunching up the gravel drive interrupted Wade's morning contemplation. She emerged from the car carrying the covered dish that had become ritual, along with the newspaper she picked up in town and whatever gossip or community news had emerged since their last visit. "Tommy's been accepted to the State University's agriculture program," Maria announced without preamble, settling the covered dish on the porch table they'd added specifically for their shared meals. Full scholarship based on his essay about sustainable ranching practices. Apparently, he quoted extensively from conversations with a local rancher who's been mentoring him. Wade felt a surge of pride that surprised him with its intensity. Tommy's success reflected well on their mentoring relationship, but more than that, it represented the kind of investment in the future that gave Wade's life meaning, beyond simple wealth accumulation or land preservation. "He's a good kid," Wade said, although the understated praise couldn't capture his genuine affection for the determined young man. "He'll make a fine rancher someday." They ate breakfast on the porch, despite the March cold, warmed by coffee and the easy conversation that had developed between two people who understood each other's losses and hopes. Maria updated him on restaurant business, community happenings, and the small dramas that connected them to their neighbors' lives. Wade shared his plans for spring planting, cattle breeding decisions, and his growing involvement in the local ranchers' association that had elected him to their advisory board. "Emma called last night," Maria said as they finished eating. "She wanted me to tell you that Jasper's doing beautifully, and that Emma's diabetes has been so stable that her doctors are reducing her monitoring requirements. She also said to remind you about their planned visit this summer." Wade smiled at the indirect message, appreciating Emma's thoughtfulness in maintaining their connection while respecting the primary bond between girl and donkey. The planned summer visit would be their third since the reunion, and each one had strengthened Wade's understanding that loving someone sometimes meant sharing them rather than possessing them. As Maria prepared to leave for the restaurant's lunch preparation, she paused at her car door and looked back at the ranch that had become as familiar to her as her own home. "Margaret would be proud of you," she said simply. "She always believed you had more love to give than you knew what to do with." After Maria's departure, Wade walked to the empty paddock that had once housed Jasper, but instead of dwelling on loss, he found himself planning improvements for Tommy's workshop. The space that had briefly sheltered an abandoned donkey would soon support a young man's education and dreams, a different kind of nurturing, but equally meaningful. Standing there in the warming sunlight of a Montana spring morning, Wade Thatcher reflected on the unexpected ways life could change course. A stubborn old rancher and an unwanted donkey had indeed saved each other, just not in the ways either had expected. Sometimes the greatest gift of love wasn't keeping what you treasured, but learning to share it with those who needed it most. The ranch felt different now, less like a fortress against the world and more like a center of connection, a place where loneliness came to be healed and where stubborn hearts learned to love again.